Welcome to the program. My guest is George Mentore. He is a professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia. George, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
So glad we could do this. George, you have done most of your work and your career focusing on issues of power, identity, cultural narrative. And I'm curious, I want to ask you to help us make sense from an anthropologist's perspective of what's going on in America today. As we're having this conversation, as this is being recorded, as we speak right at this moment, Donald Trump is being inaugurated as the next president of the United States of America. What has crossed your mind over the last few months with the campaign and his election from the perspective of an anthropologist?
Gosh, it's a really large question. As far as the inauguration is concerned, that's pretty easy. I think most anthropologists will have quite a bit to say about that. Historically, anthropology has always been, as far as the discipline is concerned, stood out because primarily of two things, mainly the study of kinship and then the study of ritual. And we've lost a little bit of ground as far as kinship study is concerned, because it's all now about race, gender, class, nationhood. But ritual has stayed with us. And it's a pretty easy one to look at the inauguration as a ritual act. I mean, that's not too... And and most of our students try to appreciate it from that point of view. Particularly the installation aspect of it, how you turn an individual, an ordinary individual, or ordinary citizen in this case, into a president, the #1 citizen of the country.
And of course, cultural rituals around the world have evidence of just that kind of thing at various different levels and experiences.
And for good reason too. I mean, if you look at what's happening right now, I think even George Washington would have agreed that the thing that worried him most about the ritual inauguration was in fact the sacred quality of it. He just didn't want to repeat the sacred quality that came from the monarchs of Europe. But we've kept that. I think there's no ritual of a political leader that doesn't have a quality of the sacred in it. And I think we're all feeling that right now.
It's interesting to see all of these cultural norms at play in this ritual for a man who ran against the norms, who in many ways derided the norms of government and democracy, and said, "I am the leader who is against those things in so many ways." And yet we're using all of these norms to ritually bestow power upon him.
Yes, this is primarily because the ritual is a political act, and while as a citizen of a nation, you aren't necessarily a representative of the state. As a state official, you have to be put into that position. I mean, this is classic anthropology, particularly from the European school, which is that there's an individual and there's a person, and those two things aren't the same. This is classic. You have to be made into a person, and the ritual turns you into that. You can't just be the president because, in many cases, just because you were elected. Look at the way in which we spoke about it. He was president-elect, and he has to be made into and that belongs to the state. That's state power.
Yeah, and the personhood is part of the social construction and the cultural narrative that we buy into.
Yeah, and that belongs to the state, and that will always be with it. That belongs to us as the members of this nation. Yeah. The presidency belongs to us, regardless of which individuals come and leave it.
Jefferson referred to that as the sacred trust. Again, the word sacred.
Yes.
The trust that citizens put in these people upon whom temporary power is bestowed.
Yeah. But keep in mind that analytically, from an anthropological point of view, which is the question you asked me, that doesn't belong to individuals. You and I pass. Society holds on to those things. You can be a father today, but that concept of the father belongs to the society that you live in. And not all societies represent fatherhood in the same way. And it's the same thing with leadership.
And it speaks to one of the greatest takeaways from the study of anthropology when we talk about the cultural narratives, the storytelling of common experiences that people accept. I've heard you say this before, it's, the same planet with many different worlds. And these cultures create these different worlds on the same planet.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's true that what we take back from our research is people's comments and discourses about, that's probably all we have. And we end up speaking about, in many ways, these generalized concepts. To have a conversation, we have to understand we're having it in one particular language.
Right.
And that language ends up being this general way of saying or getting to the fact that we can get meaning from what we're saying. But this idea that it's all discourse is really important, because if you don't get that, you don't get the point that we can actually be talking past each other on the very same subject.
Yeah, bingo. That's one reason I wanted to have you here, because as I understand it, as somebody who studied with you many years ago in grad school, trained as an anthropologist, the skeleton's key to really understanding what's happening in our politics today is to understand culture, cultural narrative, and the discourses, the storytelling that different people accept. We seem to have some very different cultures at play in our politics where people are talking past each other, as you say.
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm wondering which is the best way to unpack this, because the way that I normally do it in the classroom is to reference what I refer to as a triangle of violence, in which case the perpetrator and the victims can be identified and made into one or the other. You can have the perpetrator and victim. Sometimes even, this is actually a better response to the person who's a hero and the person who's a villain. Now listen to the way that I speak. It isn't the individual that's a hero and the individual that's a villain. It's the category of person. So the same individual can actually be a hero and a villain to different people who witness the act of the heroic.
So the same individual can be a different cultural persona.
Yeah.
Depending upon what group is.
And that's just classic.
Yeah.
Because the discourse is what we use to convince. And you see, everyone has an opinion about what's going on right now. And those who are on the extreme left or extreme right appear to have different discourses. But that's because the main character in their narrative is a hero to them. And that same hero in the other narrative is actually a villain in that narrative.
Yeah.
And it ends up being a rather, it's interesting. If you look, history could be written over and over again, depending on who controls the discourse that represents history.
Well,
those who claim to be the witness to what was going on.
Welcome to George Orwell. That was one of the takeaways of 1984 is that power, that's exactly what social power can do.
Yes.
If it has enough control of the institutions, it can totally rewrite history. It can make the heroes into villains and the villains into heroes.
Yeah, and in fact, that's where we come back to the issue of power, because that's the relationship with the power really, it's the relationship that power has with the narrative. And to be able to control the narrative allows you to exercise power much more effectively.
Right.
And this is a little different from making the claim that you have possession of power. Possession of power is one thing, but the exercise of power is by far the most effective.
And all of this, of course, speaks to the metaphor of politics as a team sport. Democrats versus Republicans, my team versus your team, go team, rah rah. It really becomes, and full of ritual and song and characters at play, just like we watch on ESPN every day.
Yeah, and it's not an accident that the metaphor for politics that has a sporting quality is the national game. That's no accident. It's a masculine game. It's built on violence. It's built on domination. And that says an awful lot about the way in which we view political power.
George, you did your field work among the Wai Indians in the Amazon rainforest in South America.
Yeah.
Those years that you spent living there in the jungle, are there lessons that you take away from that that help you understand what's happening in America today when you talk about the sport, for example, of violence, masculine violence and domination at work that we see in the drama of our politics? I'm sure you saw that at work in the jungle.
Yeah, it's the foundation of almost all that I do. And it's the critical position that most anthropologists presumably have, because one of the things that anthropology does that's, I think, remarkable in terms of its difference with all the other disciplines that's in the ivory tower is that we're asked to do field research. We're asked to live and not hang out in a library, but to actually live with real people in the real world for an extended period of time. And fortunately, what I've been done for over 30 years now, 40 years, is to keep on going back to the folks that I initially did my field research with. I want to get back to the argument, the political one directly that you offered, but I think I've been thinking about this a lot more and more, because the argument of our position in modern culture right now that's sort of taken over the world, which is different from the folks that I normally work with, the indigenous peoples of the rainforest, is this, I guess it's the tyranny of living in a wage economy. I work with people who have direct access to their own subsistence. They don't have to pay or to work to gain money, to gain food, which is something that you and I have to do. And that is by far the most outstanding thing. Now, the politics of that, the sort of political economy of that, is rather riveting. The fact that you have to subordinate yourself to an economic system in order just to eat, to even feed your own children. That doesn't happen with most indigenous peoples who have little or no contact with modernity. Now, I'm not suggesting we ever go back to the situation where we get rid of wage labor, but I would argue that that's one of our main problems that I can see as an anthropologist looking across cultures and make an assessment about where we are.
And a problem because what? Because it creates that tyrannical relationship between the individual and those who control those operations of power in the wage economy?
Well, they're very simple, straightforward. I am paid money to teach other people's children. And in fact, there's a rule against me teaching my own child. So the days that I would spend in contact with intimacy with my child, teaching her, which is something that happens in most rainforest cultures that I know of, I have to do that in order to earn money to actually put on the table the food that I would be putting into my own child's mouth. If I was in the rainforest, I would go into the field that I just worked on, take that food and give it to her. I can't do that. You and I can't even light a fire without buying a match in order to heat the food that we would want to cook. And I think that that is a very strange way to be living with the world that we live in right now. To be constantly dependent on other people for employment, constantly dependent on wages in order to just eat or put clothes on our bodies.
And of course, I'm reminded of Marx and the alienation in our lives. But it also, if I hear you right, it's in a sense, it's alienating people from their own families as well. You're not allowed to teach your own child at UVA.
And it's at a very deeply invested moment of intimacy with other human beings. That's an incredible form of alienation. You know, most of the folks that I work with have their children on their naked skin for 12 years of their first years of their lives. You know, or even 4 years at the limit. And the schools that they go to are actually in the village, not someplace else. You know, that means you're bringing up different kinds of human beings
that are much more connected to those with whom they are related.
Yeah, and connected not at a cerebral level, but at a very physical level of contact.
And what's the result of that? What do you see?
More humanity, more humanness, more care,
empathy.
more empathy. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what we have is this thing that's between you and me that actually is probably one of the worst aspects of, let's call it modernity, but a lot of people call it capitalism now, is that if you have more wealth than I have, I'm put in a position where I can't access the kinds of things that you can have. And I'm actually left to the only resource I have, which is my own body. And you could argue that that's probably one of the bases of violence. Most people who have everything taken away from them know there's one thing they cannot have taken away from them: their capacity to use their body.
And is that one reason we probably see, regardless of race, we see such violent crime among the poor and poverty?
Mm-hmm.
The same rates for regardless of race. Some people would like to make the argument that, well, it's somehow connected to race,
Mm-hmm.
when we know for a fact it's actually very connected to poverty.
Yeah, it's definitely connected. I mean, but it's all connected to poverty, but poverty isn't in and of itself. I'm not talking about poverty now in terms of wages only. It's poverty in the sense that you don't have the wealth of experience that's
Right.
available to you because you don't have access to monetary resources.
And which is why we often say that the 1% or the 0.1% that Donald Trump comes from, they live in a different world.
They absolutely do live in
And they have a totally different
Yeah.
cultural narrative about experience.
Yeah, while pretending and using the discourse they do.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, they can claim the truth that they're humans in the same way that they're human and poor people are human, right? And they could open their mouths and say something, and the person who is poor, that don't have access to wealth or power, will understand the truth that's coming from them because they've opened their mouths like other human beings and spoken. But that ability to speak and that ability to claim an empirical truth that you and I are the same because we speak the same language and because we may even look alike, isn't enough to allow those that don't have access to what the other has to be useful to them.
Because they're having completely different experiences while they're alive.
Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that the extremely wealthy don't have experiences that might be alienating to them. I think they do, but there's a way in which we all invest so much in the high status of wealth that it doesn't matter as much to them as it does to a poor person.
Yeah. George, I got to take a quick break, and we'll pick up right where we left off when we
Sure.
get back. We're talking with George Mentore, professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia. Quick break, stay with me, we'll be right back. Welcome back. My guest is George Mentore, professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia. George, before we took a break, we were talking about cultural narratives and different experiences and how, you know, in one cultural discourse, this person can be a hero. In another cultural discourse in the same nation, the person can be a villain in the drama in which people participate as spectators and viewers. Let me try to connect those dots between that and fake news. The idea that people willingly endorse these news stories. Well, take Donald Trump for example. For 5 years, he led the birther movement in America. This tremendous racist lie that Barack Obama is not an American. He's not a real American. He's not a legitimate president because he was born in Africa. That really was the beginning of Donald Trump's conscious move into political leadership. And he cultivated these followers who bought into that lie, but to them it wasn't a lie. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. That was they had the belief, and here's this news, quote unquote, that comes along, and as long as it supports it, this belief, it's accepted as fact. If this comes along and it doesn't support their belief, then it's dismissed as a lie, regardless of whether it's true or not. The belief, this cultural discourse, this narrative, comes first.
Well, this is it takes me 15 weeks to unpack this in the classroom. in this relationship between truth and power. Over and over again, we're told, certainly in modern scholarship, that the issue is really about the status of truth and not truth itself. And if it's the status of truth, and we hold truth to be so significant, so important to us, that's what really matters, first and foremost. Now, the way in which we disarticulate truth from falsehood is now the critical grounds on which we establish what is true and what is false. So if you can unravel one statement as being true, using the mechanisms that you've established for unraveling it as being true into a falsehood, then you've established for yourself that this is untrue and that maybe the other thing is true. But you keep the fact that truth is always of significance. The business about putting facts inside of truth are also dependent on what techniques that you've used. Some people don't need the kinds of methods that you and I, as rational thinkers, to put fact into truth and make it true for ourselves. Are you following me on this?
They don't necessarily have the same metric for what's true.
Yeah, and we've trained.
What's fact?
Yeah, and most of the kids that go to school in the modern world are being trained to put certain kinds of things together in order to make them true, and that's the push of scientific thinking, and the success of it. Now, if you're not trained in that tradition, there are plenty of others that can get you to truth, because truth is always going to be something that we're trying to, if not follow, at least have in the world as a way in which we can establish our own existence. Most people ordinarily only need the reality of their own existence in the now to be able to establish that truth. I'm alive right now, I'm breathing, I'm speaking, I'm talking to you, and I'm getting a reaction. I know that for a fact. So again, coming back to the reality of the body rather than the representations of bodies and all the noise, I'm represented as a black man, right? But I live the life of a human who has to take blackness into account every time I walk into the world. But that may or may not constitute the reality of who I am, given certain criteria about how I understand myself.
Of your own individual experience in the body.
Right.
Yeah.
Because my experience means that going to another part of the world every summer where blackness isn't understood as a criteria by which I should live myself. But when I step back, I have to be aware of that all the time. And that's a truth at the level of reality. Now, the truth that you get about race and blackness in the media has to support itself by a whole series of other epistemological grounds that may or may not be referenced by my experience. And the same thing could be said for white supremacists.
So talk about that for a second, because Donald Trump is heartily endorsed by white supremacists. The alt-right, a fancy new way of saying,
Wait a minute, do you really want me to go in this direction?
Well, I'm just curious what, excuse me, what your read is on that and how you understand that, because you cannot deny the fact that he blew many dog whistles appealing to racists throughout the campaign, that the white supremacists / fascists in America, and they're here, he was their guy. He is their guy.
Yeah, yeah. And for reasons that I think that the liberal middle class do not want to accept, that they themselves are racist and live in a racist society. I mean, I think the appeal of America, which, to be quite honest, is an appeal that a lot of other nations don't have, the promise of equality, is something that I think a lot of liberal Americans, white Americans in particular, hold and treasure. But it's built on the platform of the success, not of whiteness in color, but whiteness in culture. That is a way of thinking that allows for the production of certain kinds of successful products and ideas in the world that cannot be denied as being white. So when a white supremacist claim that white is supreme, there's a way in which they're actually speaking the truth. And it's very hard to deny them that.
And the white liberals in the Democratic Party can't accept that.
They won't accept it.
But their power is based on...
Absolutely based on that idea.
Yeah.
Because in many ways they want to share that whiteness with the rest of the world. And this, it's like sharing democracy across the world.
And we're right back to the 1850s and the positive good theory.
Yes.
That racist slave owners in the South said, no, slavery is a great thing because it allows us to Christianize, to whiten the African slave.
Yeah. And again, if you work systematically, I don't want to be misinterpreted in this way, if you work systematically, that what really makes the power of whiteness work, or the power of race really work, is not in color. Because this explains why so many black people would vote for Trump, and why many women would vote for Trump. Because womanhood and notions of race aren't in the skin. It's a way of thinking. It's in a narrative about who you are that you're supposed to live out.
Yeah. George, we only got about a minute left, but with that very small time window, what gives you hope? Again, Donald Trump is the President of the United States of America. What gives you hope that the principles we like to say we believe in, fairness, equality, democracy, true justice, that those stand a chance?
I've been thinking about this for a bit, and very, very quickly, let me use another metaphor and analogy, and I think it makes sense for me at the level of music, for example. And for me in the academy, the difference between the social sciences and the humanities. When you're playing music, and you get that awe-inspiring sense of, wow, it's carrying me someplace, you are not usually at the same time breaking that music down into what key am I playing in, and what sort of scales should I run, or what note should I play. That latter part is what we do in the academy, and that's what we do with rationalist thoughts over and over. We try to break things down, and we miss the awe-inspiring aspect of being carried somewhere else.
That holistic experience.
The holistic experience. And there is something inspiring about the presidency. There is something inspiring about the hope and aspirations that Americans have for America, and of course for the rest of the world, and to be thrilled by that. And I think that's what really surprised the electorate with this last election. The mere fact that we were thinking far too rationally and expected a rational outcome. No one ever believed that the irrational could actually win out.
George, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it. Let's do it again. George Mentore is at the University of Virginia, the Department of Anthropology. You can find him online. I'm Coy Barefoot, and the complete archive of this program is at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.